Hi everyone, I'm Esther Wright and I'm lecturer in digital history at Cardiff University. And I'm really happy to have been invited to share a little bit about my research and approach to historical game studies, which I'll spend the majority of this video overviewing before finishing off with some slightly more work in progress thoughts about future directions and methodological challenges that I've been thinking about and trying to deal with over the last few years. In my work, I argue for the importance of studying promotional materials and various other paratexts associated with historical video games. Game studies in general has been slow or inconsistent in centering paratexts and considering them to be important sites for consideration. But through my work, I argue that they are important for a number of reasons. Firstly, they are key sites at which game companies often perform the role of developer historian, to use Adam Chapman's term, and they perform this role to assert their legitimacy in creating games about some aspect of the past. And usually they discuss their research process and labour in a way that allows them to claim the authenticity of their games. And authenticity is sometimes used interchangeably with other words like accuracy, realism, faithfulness, and so on. Often, though, all these terms serve a similar purpose in that they seek to place value on the interpretation of the past that a game offers and commodify this in its promotional surround. There's usually little agreement about what authenticity actually means or consists of, which is obviously its value in different circumstances. So, Richard Peterson's term authenticity work is useful to conceptualize the fact that authenticity is not and could never be an inherent property of anything, media product or otherwise, but is rather a claim made on behalf of something by an agent that can be received positively or negatively by whoever's consuming that product. But as has been noted by critics who've sort of theorised the idea of authenticity, such as Rob Horning, authenticity as it is marketed and commercialised by brands through their products acts as a simplifying force. And applying this argument to historical video games, evoking authenticity allows a company to strip away complexity and the messiness inherent in historical research to offer the one most real and ultimately most valuable interactive representation of the past, which of course is, at the very least, never a representative or complete picture of historical complexity and difference, which obviously no history could be. But the more sinister and, I guess, nuanced explanation for this is that if authenticity is simplifying, it is often simplifying historical narratives in a way that perpetuates hegemonic interpretations of the past and what it was really like. It often means rather that the same stories with the same central characters get told again and again. So, as Adrian Shaw has noted, there's a tendency to focus on privilege authenticity or realism or make claims for accuracy. And this is done in both game development and marketing. And ultimately, it works to preempt criticisms of the historical narratives a game offers, and usually the insidious ideological arguments a game makes implicitly or explicitly. By way of a really recent example of this, as I'm writing and recording this at the end of August, all of these things I've just spoken out about play out in the reveal trailer for Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. And this has been deconstructed in much greater detail across social media and in popular games criticism, like the excellent examples here by Emil Hammer and Ian Walker. But very briefly, the trailer for the game used archival footage of an interview with Soviet defector Yuri Bezmenov in 1984 as real historical evidence for a trailer that aims to contextualize the game. And in particular, the claims that he made about the way that the Soviet Union used certain tactics in an attempt to destabilize the US at the time. But his views essentially speak to alt-right conspiracy theories about cultural Marxism, which you wouldn't actually take away necessarily from the trailer itself unless you went away and read more about him as a figure and his beliefs. And plenty of prominent far-right figures in the wider gaming community have been really overjoyed about the fact that his views have been given such a mainstream airing. So the trailer itself, while incorporating the historical antecedent for right-wing views popularized by Gamegate, used it to tell players that they should know their history. The reveal trailer allows Activision to perform the role of historian, cite and incorporate real historical evidence for their potential players, and therefore claim the authenticity of the game's version of the past. But this is all done so on a foundation of alt-right conspiracies that are inherently racist, misogynist, and anti-LGBTQ, among a number of other things. My perspective on this comes from my own research, which focuses on Rockstar Games. And my PhD thesis that I'm currently turning into a monograph looked at the representation of American history in Red Dead Redemption and LA Noire in particular though I'm also currently working on some projects that involve Red Dead Redemption 2 as well. In addition to studying these games as texts and what they tell us about the way Rockstar have sought to retell American history through all of their games, I also looked at promotional materials as sites through which Rockstar positioned themselves as an authority on American history and used them to make claims about the authenticity of their interpretation and subsequent representation of America's past. And really, the purpose of this work was not only to offer this sustained look at Rockstar's broader historical project, but also to argue for the importance of incorporating promotional materials into our work in historical game studies to make more nuanced arguments about how these games often privilege a very specific and exclusionary version of history and why they do so. So, one of the key ways in which Rockstar sought to generate expectations for the historical authenticity of their games and really perform this role of historian was through blog posts published to the Newswire section of the official Rockstar website. As the name probably suggests, this is a space for direct company to fan communication used by Rockstar to circulate information about current or forthcoming releases. Newswire posts were a key resource for my thesis, and especially the blog posts that were published in the months leading up to and directly following the release of Red Dead Redemption and LA Noire. They were categorized under the research tag that you could use to filter posts, and they were spaces in which Rockstar intentionally tried to occupy the role of developer historian. The sum product of these, when you look at them together, all of these blog posts spread across a number of different series, each with a specific but interlocking intention, were new historical narratives about America's southwestern frontier at the turn of the 20th century, and for LA Noire, about life in US society in the post war period. These narratives were constructed almost entirely as pedagogical tools intended to tell players what they should expect from the games, so their worlds, affordances, and narratives, and were constructed from different kinds of historical evidence deliberately selected to make it appear as though Rockstar's game design decisions and the limits that these games inevitably imposed offered an authentic experience of America's past. Certain newswire posts use specific kinds of historical evidence, encouraging players to read or identify the themes, characters, and other elements included in the games as authentic, or in some way faithful to real events, people, processes, and so on. For Red Dead Redemption, this took the form of blog posts under the heading The True West, History That Helped Inspire Red Dead Redemption. And these posts, on the one hand, made reference to certain Wild West figures like Frank James, who broadly fit the archetype of bad guy gone good, or vice versa. And these kinds of people who supposedly wavered in terms of the morality and criminality of their behavior were intended then to support the sort of basis in fact of the character of John Marston and what players would do as him. So one of the quotations taken from one of these blogs was that unlike the pure fantasy of most video games, John Marston's backstory was very real. Other posts made reference to some of the historical and technological processes underway at the turn of the 20th century, like the development of weaponry and industrialization. So, in essence, many of the key themes that Red Dead's narrative or world engages were picked out and highlighted, curated into a new narrative of what this period was like in a way that best legitimized and authenticated the game's historical fictions amidst a backdrop of truth. In all of the posts, screenshots of the games were set alongside historical images and illustrations, and allusions to authenticity or realism were basically everywhere. For LA Noire, on the other hand, a series of newswire posts under the heading Real Crimes That Helped Inspire LA Noire's Cases detailed several real, unsolved, or partially solved crimes that were actually committed in 1947 Los Angeles, offering players an authentic connection to real but fictionalized events which they could interact with and ultimately solve by playing the game. For both of these games, a premium is placed on the meticulous research that Rockstar's internal research department undertook, or Team Bondi, who co-developed LA Noire, and that doing so underpins an experience that is all the more authentic and real. The posts usually just deploy and cite specific evidence, usually by including numerous hyperlinks in these posts, often directing players to certain Wikipedia entries or other online encyclopedias and other websites that offer players a deeper level of historical engagement, if you can call it that, I guess, which ultimately validates and props up Rockstar's own authored American history. Because what these new narratives amount to ultimately is the wholesale simplification of the complexities of each game's corresponding period in a way that best fits Rockstar's interpretation of it. This interpretation of the history of the frontier and of post-war American society essentially only incorporates the elements of the past that Red Dead and LA Noire speak to in a way that makes it seem as though there is no sort of true or real history of these periods beyond what players are told in kind of meticulous detail in some cases. They're selective in that they reinforce the historical themes and processes and events that the game speaks to, and those that have become implicitly associated with these historical periods through successive waves of popular culture about the past. In the case of Red Dead Redemption, this means so-called revisionist westerns from the 1960s onwards that privilege brutality, violence, and white masculinity as their cornerstones. And for LA Noire, it's a very neo-noir interpretation of the post-war period and its zeitgeist as inherently dark, existential, and bleak, centered around the typical noir investigatory narrative and the white man investigator at its center. And this is the way that American history is simplified in a way that best supports Rockstar's claims for authenticity and allows them to perform the role of developer historian and induct players into the company's ways of seeing the true quote unquote past. And this is something obviously that then I explore in greater detail in my work more broadly. So where I'm essentially aiming to go with this is towards a more defined method for locating and studying historical video game promotional materials and various digital paratexts. And one of the main challenges of this is the ephemeral nature of these largely digital materials. They appear and serve a purpose for a particular period of time, but there's no centralized database for these materials, and they are especially prone to things like link rot or just outright being lost and not archived in a way that makes it a particularly challenging experience to collate and piece together a complete picture of the promotional surround of any game. Locating these materials is a reasonably ad hoc approach, or requires a reasonably ad hoc approach, even when trawling developer websites or the sort of usual suspects in terms of sites that publish developer interviews or other kinds of features. Some of these websites don't even exist anymore, as they would have in 2010 or 2011. And it takes a flexible approach and a level of acceptance to understand that you won't find or see everything, even if you are keeping track of it in real time, as I so desperately tried to do when Red Dead Redemption 2 was being released in 2018. Even then it's pretty much impossible, and we have to assume that a complete picture of what players could have seen or could have interacted with will never be built anyway. Also throughout the course of my working on this project, one of my key source bases, the official Rockstar website, was reformatted at least twice. And the promotional blogs I previously discussed suffered from link rot, so they weren't able to be accessed in their original form. There was at one point a wealth of comments underneath each of these posts, which would have been really useful as a resource in studying how players were interacting with these pedagogical resources that Rockstar provided, and how Rockstar's marketing team were responding in turn and interacting as a kind of company to fan instance. But all of those comments disappeared too, and the Internet Archive doesn't have a complete record of them as they were either. It's, as always, sporadic at best. So ultimately, even 4 to 5 years in advance, I wasn't able to study these games as they, originally looked in terms of their promotional surround, or the way they were accessed and interacted with by players. And this is compounded by two factors, both in terms of the way we study your video game paratexts and the way we think of them as cultural objects, or rather don't think of them. And as I mentioned previously, game study, very broadly speaking, has yet to fully account for paratexts in terms of definitions or methods, though this does seem to be something that's changing. These materials are often either overlooked or not the principal focus of preservation initiatives and activities too. Precisely because these materials are not the game, they don't fall under the kind of hardware, software realms that we consider to be so important for preservation. They're often something just added on or thought about as an aside. Even in game history or preservation initiatives that are being undertaken at the moment, there's no real sense of how we do these things. How do we collect and preserve them? This is complicated. How would we even begin to exhibit them, for example? Yet they hold so much potential for creating more nuanced and richer narratives, not only of the histories of games and their place in society, as curators like Elena Stati have recently argued, but also, I argue for the histories in games. If we are to undertake a more complete and nuanced analysis of the construction of history in video games, then it's not enough to only preserve games and their consoles to be played on for future study. There is so much going on at the paratextual margins of games that we need to think about. And, I don't have answers for this yet. So this is where I ultimately draw things to a close, but I'm working on it. So feedback or questions in this area would be very much appreciated. And that's it as a very broad overview of what I have been working on and what I'm hoping to work on in the future. As I said, I welcome any kind of comments or feedback or suggestions. And if you want to get in touch with me directly, this is my email address and Twitter, and something that I published a couple of years ago, which again really overviews sort of my thinking, my current thinking, I guess, on the promotional context of historical video games.